The diplomatic quarters aboard the Terran Alliance vessel Prometheus hummed with the steady rhythm of recycled air and distant engine vibrations. Captain Jake Morrison had seen his share of interstellar politics in his 15 years of service, but nothing had prepared him for the delicate dance of first contact protocols with the Valyrian Empire. The blue-skinned humanoids had agreed to preliminary negotiations after months of careful communication through subspace channels, and now 3 of their representatives sat across from him in sterile conference room. Ambassador Lyra stood nearly 7 feet tall with elegant features and flowing silver hair that seemed to shimmer in the artificial lighting. Her companions Kale and Thuron flanked her like protective shadows, their own imposing frames wrapped in the flowing ceremonial robes that marked their diplomatic status. The Valyrians had insisted on maintaining their traditional customs during the talks, which Jake respected, even if he didn't fully understand the intricacies of their culture. The morning session had gone well with both sides, making tentative progress on trade agreements and territorial boundaries. Jake felt cautiously optimistic as they broke for lunch, though he noticed Lyra seemed more tense than usual. She had been glancing toward the corridor leading to the guest quarters with increasing frequency, and her normally composed demeanor showed subtle cracks of anxiety. As the other diplomats filed out, Jake gathered his notes and prepared to return to his quarters for a brief rest before the afternoon session. The ship felt unusually quiet during the break period, with most of the crew either on duty or taking advantage of the rare downtime. He made his way through the curved corridors of the diplomatic section, noting how the Valyrians had requested quarters far from the main crew areas for privacy and cultural reasons. A sudden crash from behind one of the guest doors made Jake freeze in his tracks. The sound of shattering ceramics was followed by what sounded like distressed voices speaking in the melodic Valyrian language. His training kicked in immediately because the safety of the diplomatic mission took precedence over protocol. Without hesitation, he activated the emergency override on the door controls and stepped inside to assess the situation. The sight that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. Ambassador Lyra stood in the center of the room, completely unclothed with her ceremonial robes pooled around her feet. Her blue skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and intricate silver markings covered her arms and torso in patterns that spoke of ancient traditions. She had been reaching for something on a high shelf when she apparently lost her balance and knocked over a decorative vase. For a moment that stretched into eternity, neither of them moved. Jake's mind raced through every piece of cultural briefing he had received about the Valyrians, but nothing had prepared him for this scenario. Lyra's eyes widened in what he could only interpret as horror, and she made a sound that was part gasp and part wail. Her hands flew to cover herself, but the damage was already done. The door behind Jake slid open with a soft whisper, and Kale stepped into the room. The Valyrian male took in the scene with a single glance, and his expression shifted from confusion to something approaching rage. He began speaking rapidly in his native language, with Lyra responding in increasingly frantic tones. Jake caught fragments of translation from his neural implant, but the conversation was moving too fast for him to follow completely. Thuron appeared moments later and added his voice to the heated discussion. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to leave or stay, but sensing that his presence was somehow central to whatever crisis was unfolding. The Valyrians seemed to be arguing about him specifically, though he couldn't understand why seeing someone unclothed would cause such an extreme reaction. Finally, Lyra seemed to reach some kind of decision and turned to face Jake directly. Her voice carried a mixture of resignation and determination as she spoke in carefully measured English. The human had seen her in her natural state, which, according to the most sacred laws of her people, created an unbreakable bond between them. In Valyrian culture, such intimate knowledge could only exist between bonded pairs, and the penalty for violating this taboo was death for both parties involved. Jake felt the blood drain from his face as the implications sank in. He had stumbled into a cultural minefield without even realizing it, and now both their lives hung in the balance. The Valyrian Empire took their traditions seriously and would not hesitate to execute both him and Lyra if they discovered what had happened. The only way to avoid this fate was for them to undergo the bonding ceremony, immediately thus legitimizing his knowledge through marriage. The concept seemed absurd to Jake's human sensibilities, but he could see the deadly seriousness in all three Valyrians' expressions. This was not a matter of choice or personal preference, but of survival in a culture that valued honor above individual desires. Kale and Thuron were already discussing how to arrange the ceremony in secret while maintaining the facade of normal diplomatic relations. As the reality of the situation settled over him, Jake found himself studying Lyra's face for any sign of how she felt about this forced union. Her features remained composed, but he caught glimpses of fear and uncertainty in her golden eyes. She was as trapped by circumstance as he was, and neither of them had any real choice in the matter. The alternative was simply too terrible to contemplate. The afternoon diplomatic session proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that Jake struggled to hide from his own staff. Every time he looked at Lyra across the conference table, he was reminded of the impossible situation they faced. She maintained her professional demeanor perfectly, but he noticed subtle signs of stress in the way she held herself and the slight tremor in her hands when she reached for her water glass. Kale and Thuron had volunteered to handle the logistics of the bonding ceremony, which apparently required specific rituals and witnesses from the Valyrian community. They would need to contact other Empire ships in the sector and arrange for a proper officiant to travel to the Prometheus. The whole process would take at least 3 days to organize properly, and until then Jake and Lyra would have to maintain absolute secrecy about their predicament. That evening, Jake found himself pacing his quarters and trying to process the enormity of what was happening. In the span of a few hours, his life had been turned completely upside down by a simple accident and a cultural misunderstanding. He was about to enter into an alien marriage with someone he barely knew simply to avoid execution by her people. The absurdity of it all might have been funny if the stakes weren't so impossibly high. A soft chime from his door interrupted his brooding, and he opened it to find Lyra standing in the corridor. She had changed from her formal diplomatic robes into simpler clothing that somehow made her seem more approachable. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he could see the strain around her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. She asked if they could talk privately, and Jake stepped aside to let her enter his quarters. The space suddenly felt much smaller with her presence, and he was acutely aware of how this meeting would be interpreted by her people if they were discovered. Every interaction between them now carried the weight of their shared secret and the looming threat of discovery. Lyra moved to the small seating area and settled herself with the fluid grace that seemed natural to her species. She began to explain the cultural significance of what had happened and why the Valyrian response was so extreme. In her society, the unclothed form was considered sacred and deeply personal. Only bonded pairs were permitted to see each other in such a state, and even then it was reserved for the most intimate moments of their relationship. The taboo existed to preserve the sanctity of the bonding process and to prevent casual relationships from undermining the social order. When an unbonded individual was seen unclothed by someone of the opposite gender, it created what their culture called a soul bond, whether the participants intended it or not. This bond was considered so powerful that it could not be broken except by death, and attempting to ignore it was seen as a crime against the natural order. Jake listened with growing amazement as Lyra described the philosophical underpinnings of her people's beliefs. The Valyrians viewed the physical form as a reflection of the soul, and believed that sharing such intimate knowledge created an unbreakable spiritual connection. From their perspective, what had happened in her quarters was not an accident, but a manifestation of cosmic will that neither of them could fight. As she spoke, Jake found himself studying her face and mannerisms with new interest. Lyra was clearly intelligent and thoughtful, with a depth of character that went far beyond her role as a diplomatic ambassador. Under different circumstances, he might have found her attractive and intriguing, but the forced nature of their situation made it impossible to separate genuine interest from survival instinct. The conversation continued late into the night as they discussed the practical aspects of their impending marriage. Lyra explained that the bonding ceremony would create legal and social obligations that would last for the rest of their lives. They would be expected to maintain the appearance of a genuine relationship, and any sign of discord or separation would bring shame upon both their families and potentially destabilize the diplomatic process. Jake realized that his decision to enter her quarters had consequences that extended far beyond their personal lives. The success or failure of their marriage could impact relations between their entire species and potentially determine whether humanity would be welcomed into the galactic community or rejected as culturally incompatible. The weight of that responsibility settled over him like a heavy blanket. When Lyra finally returned to her quarters, Jake lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had become so complicated. 3 days ago, he had been a simple starship captain, focused on his duties and the welfare of his crew. Now he was preparing to marry an alien diplomat in a ceremony that would bind them together for life. The irony was not lost on him that first contact with another species would be remembered not for grand speeches or historic treaties, but for an embarrassing accident and a shotgun wedding. The next morning brought new challenges as Jake struggled to maintain his professional composure during the diplomatic sessions. Every interaction with Lyra felt loaded with hidden meaning, and he found himself second-guessing every word and gesture. His staff began to notice his distraction, and he had to work harder to project the calm confidence they expected from their commanding officer. Meanwhile, Kale and Thuron had been busy making arrangements for the ceremony. A Valyrian priest was traveling from a nearby system and would arrive within 48 hours to perform the bonding ritual. They had also contacted Lyra's family to inform them of the situation, though Jake suspected the explanation they received was carefully edited to protect diplomatic relations. The idea of explaining to his own family that he had accidentally married an alien was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. The cultural briefings continued as Lyra attempted to prepare Jake for what he could expect from Valyrian marriage customs. Their society was built around the concept of complementary partnerships, where each spouse brought different strengths and perspectives to the relationship. The bonding ceremony would create not just a legal union, but a spiritual connection that was believed to enhance both individuals and make them more effective as a team. Jake found himself fascinated by the complexity of Valyrian social structures and the way they balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. Their marriage customs seemed designed to create stable long-term partnerships that could weather the challenges of interstellar life and maintain family bonds across vast distances. In many ways, their approach seemed more thoughtful and deliberate than the often chaotic nature of human relationships. As the day of the ceremony approached, Jake felt his anxiety building to almost unbearable levels. He had agreed to this marriage as a matter of survival, but now he was beginning to understand the full implications of what he was committing to. This would not be a marriage of convenience that could be quietly dissolved once the diplomatic mission was complete. According to Valyrian law and custom, he and Lyra would be bound together until death separated them. The priest arrived on schedule, accompanied by 2 additional witnesses who would ensure the ceremony was conducted according to proper tradition. Jake was struck by the solemnity of the occasion and the reverence with which the Valyrians approached the ritual. This was clearly not something they took lightly, and their commitment to following every detail of the ancient protocols spoke to the deep cultural significance of what was happening. The ceremony itself was surprisingly beautiful despite the circumstances that had led to it. Jake and Lyra stood before the priest in a small chamber that had been decorated with flowing fabrics and softly glowing crystals. The words spoken were in the ancient Valyrian language, but the translator provided him with a running commentary of the vows they were making to each other. The promises were surprisingly comprehensive, covering everything from mutual support and protection to shared responsibility for any children they might have. When the priest declared them, bonded Jake felt a strange sensation wash over him, as if something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with Lyra. She looked at him with an expression that seemed to hold new depth and meaning, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a flicker of hope that their marriage might be more than just a survival strategy. Perhaps with time and effort, they could build something genuine from the foundation of necessity that had brought them together. The reception that followed was a subdued affair attended only by the essential witnesses and a few trusted members of both crews. Jake and Lyra sat together at the head table, making polite conversation, while everyone pretended this was a normal celebration rather than the result of a diplomatic crisis. The food was a fusion of human and Valyrian cuisine that actually worked surprisingly well, and Jake found himself relaxing slightly as the evening progressed. As the formal celebration wound down, Jake realized that he and Lyra would now be expected to share quarters, as befitted a newly bonded couple. The thought filled him with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that he was not entirely prepared to examine too closely. They had spent the last few days getting to know each other as individuals, but now they would have to navigate the intimate aspects of marriage while still maintaining their professional responsibilities. The transition to married life aboard the Prometheus proved to be both easier and more difficult than Jake had anticipated. On one hand, Lyra was an easy person to live with who respected his need for privacy and personal space, while contributing her own perspectives and insights to their shared environment. On the other hand, the constant awareness of their unique situation and the pressure to maintain appearances created an underlying tension that colored every interaction. The diplomatic negotiations continued with both sides working toward a comprehensive treaty that would establish formal relations between their species. Jake found that his new relationship with Lyra actually enhanced his effectiveness as a negotiator, since he now had direct access to Valyrian cultural insights and perspectives. She proved to be an invaluable partner in understanding the nuances of her people's positions and finding creative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. As weeks passed, Jake began to realize that his feelings toward Lyra were evolving beyond simple cooperation and mutual respect. She was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once she became comfortable with him. Her dedication to her people and her profession was admirable, and he found himself genuinely enjoying their conversations and shared experiences. The physical attraction that had been complicated by their forced circumstances was slowly being replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. The moment of truth came during a particularly difficult negotiation session when tensions between the two sides threatened to derail the entire diplomatic process. Jake and Lyra found themselves working together to find common ground and bridge the gap between their people's different approaches to interstellar relations. Their collaboration was so natural and effective that even the other diplomats began to comment on their partnership. That evening, as they reviewed the day's progress in their shared quarters, Jake realized that somewhere along the way he had stopped thinking of Lyra as an obligation and started thinking of her as his wife. The distinction was subtle but profound, and it colored everything about how he viewed their relationship and their future together. When he shared this realization with her, she smiled and admitted that she had been experiencing similar feelings. The successful conclusion of the diplomatic treaty was celebrated by both crews with a joint ceremony that marked the beginning of a new era in human-Valyrian relations. Jake and Lyra stood together as representatives of what their species could accomplish when they worked together as partners rather than adversaries. The irony that their marriage had begun as a desperate attempt to avoid execution was not lost on either of them, but it no longer seemed to matter. As the Prometheus prepared to return to Earth, Jake found himself looking forward to introducing Lyra to human society and culture. She had expressed interest in visiting his home world and meeting his family, which would no doubt be an interesting experience for everyone involved. The idea of explaining to his parents that he had married an alien diplomat to avoid being executed by her people was still daunting, but he was confident that they would accept Lyra once they got to know her. The journey home gave them time to plan for their future together and discuss how they would balance their respective careers with their personal relationship. Lyra had been offered a position with the new Interspecies Council that would be established to oversee ongoing diplomatic relations, and Jake was being considered for command of one of the new exploration vessels that would be built using combined human and Valyrian technology. Their marriage, which had begun as a matter of survival, had evolved into something neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure. The cultural accident that had thrown them together had ultimately created an opportunity for genuine connection and partnership that might never have existed otherwise. As they prepared to face their future together, Jake realized that sometimes the most important things in life came from the most unexpected circumstances. The final diplomatic reports were filed, and the official ceremonies concluded as the Prometheus entered the Sol system with its precious cargo of new allies and expanded possibilities. Jake and Lyra stood together on the observation deck, watching Earth grow larger in the view screen and planning for the life they would build together. Their story would become legend among both species as proof that understanding and cooperation could overcome even the most challenging cultural barriers. What had begun as an embarrassing accident had transformed into something beautiful and meaningful that would serve as a foundation for generations of peaceful cooperation between their peoples. The marriage of Captain Jake Morrison and Ambassador Lyra would be remembered not as a desperate survival strategy, but as the first step toward a future where humans and Valyrians could work together as equals and partners in exploring the vast mysteries of the galaxy.